There's been a list of demands beyond that meeting between Penny Wong and Wang Yi from China about resetting the relationship. China specifically has 4 demands. The first, that Australia must treat China as a partner rather than a rival. 2, our 2 countries must seek common ground while shelving our differences. 3, that we must reject manipulation, and this means, of course, we've got to reject the US. And 4, both countries must build public support by being both positive and pragmatic. Let's get the take of my next guest on all of that. National Editor at The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. Thank you for your time. I thought the PM today, Dennis, was pretty strong in rejecting these demands. We've had this positive meeting with Wang Yi and Penny Wong, but he's making it very clear we're not going to dance to China's tune. So tonight, are we in the freezer with China or halfway out on our way to being thawed? What do you think?
Well, I think Penny Wong, and I must say Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese have handled this very well. They've allowed no division, no distractions from the Chinese. I think that clearly Penny Wong said that this was about stabilising the relationship. It's not about a thaw, it's not getting better, it's to try and stop it getting worse, and that's where we are at the moment. I think the meeting took place in the freezer. It's still there, and I think that Anthony Albanese's very strong words about our national interest, again rejecting another list of demands from China. It is not about China issuing demands. That has to stop before we can actually start a thaw.
Right, I mentioned at the top the PMs are off on Wednesday to Fiji. This is the Pacific Leaders meeting. It's obviously critically important given the push by China into our region. Interestingly, when you look at the agenda, the 2 big issues are China and climate change. Now, I call BS on this push by these Pacific nations. If they really cared about the climate, they wouldn't be courting China, would they?
Well, this is a bit of a bizarre approach. You know, the Pacific Islands have legitimate concerns about climate change, but we have seen that China has spread its influence all through the South Pacific, and what the South Pacific nations are saying is that they want action taken on climate change, including trying to make climate change a human rights issue. Now, if this was really about the general global climate change, then they wouldn't be cuddling up to China as they are, because China is the biggest polluter in the world and it's doing very little about it. So I think that we need to see, if they're trying to take macro global approaches, then they need to actually apply the same rules to China as well as they are trying to apply to Australia.
Yeah, but we know it's cash over climate. That's what this is about. That's what it was, certainly in the Solomon Islands. And we see over the weekend they're banning, the Solomon Islands are banning Australian aid workers, but allowing pretty ready entry for Chinese workers.
Yes, and look, Australia has just this afternoon announced drought aid for Kiribati. Now, Kiribati isn't even going to the meeting. So what we've actually got is the old problems of different rivalries within the South Pacific community itself and different political agendas, with the overlay of the Chinese intervention in the Pacific. And I think that Anthony Albanese is going to have his hands full trying to satisfy the demands from the South Pacific without going overboard by handing aid which needs to be controlled to the Pacific rather than just bucketed in to the coffers.
Talk to me about Sri Lanka over the weekend, a real eruption in this economic crisis that's been playing out for some time. I'll get into the agricultural genesis for it a bit later on in the show, but you've got the President and the Prime Minister both fleeing the country, set to resign. Their residences were stormed in Colombo. I suspect we could have trouble for ourselves here, potentially more boats on our way if things aren't quietened down pretty quickly.
Well, of course, over the past years, Sri Lanka has been one of the great sources of people that people smugglers have tried to exploit, and the long run from internal problems and civil war in Sri Lanka really fed a lot of the push factors from Sri Lanka towards the people smuggling to Australia. I think what the real challenge is now, as we see this increased pressure, we have seen boats already depart and be turned back. What we have to see is that the new government ensures that the pull factors are kept in line as well, and that they maintain a very stern line on returning boats and turning back boats before they build any momentum of the renewed people smuggling. There will be pressure, there's no doubt about that.
And just before the ABC and The Guardian and everyone lurched down this path, of course, the economic collapse of a country does not meet the definition of refugee under international law. That is, someone needing to flee their country for fear of persecution, for their life being at risk. That's not the situation in Sri Lanka. But migration's a big topic today. This is internal migration in Australia. 2021, which was last year, massive movements of Australians. Almost 500,000 of us moved around the country. The worst state, unsurprisingly, of course, was Victoria. 32,000 Victorians fled the state. Those sorts of numbers, Dennis, haven't been seen since the 90s recession in Victoria. What did you make of the movements? No surprises, I suspect.
Well, no, I suppose. And of course, the COVID pandemic has had a great impact on this. It's having a great psychological impact on a lot of Australians, but it's coupled with the same economic pressures that were occurring during the recession: high interest rates, property markets, prices getting out of control, difficulty with buying a house. And so people are naturally moving to areas where they can afford to buy a house, even if it is still difficult. So that there are economic pressures on this, people moving out of the bigger cities. New South Wales lost people too, as people moved out of Sydney. Part of it was COVID, where they moved into regional areas. But I think that all of these things are coming together, and so that psychologically you had the force of the big lockdowns, particularly in Melbourne, playing into the growing economic pressures. And so we're going to see a lot more internal migration as people go to regional areas, cheaper areas to live, and also, just as they're moving to the suburbs in the big cities where they've got more space because they've felt constrained by the pandemic. Not just the lockdowns, but the health aspects has made people look for more space, and there's going to be a lot more travel out of Victoria, particularly to Queensland and Western Australia.
I feel like I must be the only muppet in the country to have actually moved to Victoria in this time, Dennis. Everybody else has fled. We'll see what happens over coming months. I suspect it will get worse. Thank you for your time.